Whispers echoed through town whenever she walked past. 6 agonizing years of mockery sabotage and crippling debt piled on her shoulders. Neighbors called her crazy for wasting prime pasture on foreign weeds. They laughed until that fateful morning in 1988 when those weeds made her an overnight millionaire. Dust swirled across the cracked earth of the sprawling 400-acre property, carrying with it the bitter reality of failure. Sarah Jenkins stood on the porch of her late father's farmhouse, a weathered piece of paper trembling in her calloused hands. It was the spring of 1982, and the letter from Oakhaven National Bank was unambiguous. She had 6 months to pay off the crippling $80,000 debt her father had accumulated, or the bank would seize the land that had been in her family for 3 generations. Oakhaven, a stubborn agricultural community, nestled in the sweeping valleys of Oregon, was a place where tradition dictated survival. You grew winter wheat or you ran cattle. There were no other options. But the soil on the Jenkins property had been depleted by decades of overgrazing and poor crop rotation. The land was exhausted, and so was Sarah. Arthur Pendleton, the senior loan officer at Oakhaven National, had made his position perfectly clear during their last meeting. He sat behind his mahogany desk, steepled his fingers, and offered a condescending smile. "Sarah, you are a resilient young woman, but dirt doesn't care about resilience," Arthur had said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Sell the acreage to Richard Gable. He's offering enough to clear your father's debt and leave you with enough to start over in the city. It's the only logical choice." Richard Gable was the wealthiest cattle rancher in the county. He owned the sprawling estates bordering Sarah's farm and had coveted her family's land for a decade. He didn't want it for farming. He wanted the water rights to the deep aquifer that sat untouched beneath her rocky pastures. Gable had already driven 2 other desperate families out of town with his aggressive lowball offers and ruthless intimidation tactics. Sarah crumpled the bank notice and stuffed it into her denim jacket pocket. She would rather burn the farmhouse to the ground than hand the keys to Richard Gable. Desperation breeds unorthodox solutions. For weeks, Sarah spent her nights in the dusty archives of the county library, poring over agricultural journals, soil composition charts, and foreign botanical registries. She had a grand total of $12,000 left to her name, the payout from her father's meager life insurance policy. It wasn't enough to buy a viable herd of cattle, and it certainly wasn't enough to fertilize 400 acres for a wheat crop that would likely fail in the alkaline soil. Then she found it. An obscure horticultural study from a university in Australia, detailing a specific hybrid of Eucalyptus nitens, the shining gum. The study noted that this particular hybrid thrived in poor alkaline soil, required minimal irrigation once established, and grew at an astonishing rate. More importantly, the timber was highly sought after for specialized paper pulp, and the leaves yielded a premium essential oil. It was a massive gamble. Eucalyptus was completely alien to Oakhaven. The climate was slightly colder than the tree's native habitat, but the study suggested this specific hybrid possessed extraordinary frost tolerance. Against the frantic advice of her only friend in town, a mechanic named Dennis Harper, Sarah, wired $10,000 to a specialized nursery in Northern California that imported Australian seeds and saplings. She spent her remaining $2,000 renting a heavy-duty tractor to rip through the compacted pasture dirt, preparing endless rows for planting. When the flatbed trucks arrived in Oakhaven 2 weeks later, carrying thousands of slender, pale green eucalyptus saplings, the entire town stopped to stare. Word spread faster than a prairie fire. By the time Sarah began unloading the trucks, a small crowd had gathered at the edge of her property line. Richard Gable sat atop his polished black horse, flanked by 2 of his ranch hands, laughing openly. "What in God's name are you doing, Jenkins?" Gable yelled, his voice carrying over the rumble of the diesel engines. "You planting weeds? Is that your grand plan to save the farm? Giant, thirsty weeds." "They're timber trees, Richard," Sarah shot back, wiping sweat from her forehead. "And they're none of your business." Timber. Mayor Harrison Davies, who had driven out just to see the spectacle, chuckled from the window of his sedan. "Sarah, sweetheart, those twigs will freeze to death by November. You're throwing away your father's legacy on a foreign experiment. Gable's offer is still on the table. Don't be foolish." Sarah ignored them, turning her back to the road. For the next 3 weeks, she worked from before dawn until long after dusk, manually planting over 10,000 saplings. Her hands blistered and bled, her back ached with a deep, throbbing pain. But she didn't stop. Every time she heard a pickup truck slow down on the county road so the driver could gawk and point, she dug her trowel into the dirt with renewed ferocity. By the end of May, the pasture was transformed into a bizarre, symmetrical grid of fragile green sticks waving in the Oregon wind. The town's local diner became a hub of betting. The general consensus was that the bank would own the Jenkins farm by Christmas. Nobody believed the fragile exotic plants would survive the harsh Oak Haven winter. As the first frost of 1982 descended upon the valley, casting a glittering, icy death sentence over the landscape, Sarah stood at her window, clutching a mug of black coffee. She looked out at her bizarre forest, praying to a god she wasn't sure was listening. If the frost killed the roots, it was over. Richard Gable would win, and she would be a laughing stock forever. Spring of 1983 arrived not with a sudden thaw, but with a slow, creeping warmth that finally melted the stubborn frost. Sarah walked the endless rows of her pasture with her heart lodged in her throat. She knelt beside the first sapling. The top leaves were brittle, blackened by the freezing temperatures. A bitter taste of defeat washed over her, but as her fingers brushed the base of the slender trunk, she felt a firm, waxy resistance. Beneath the dead top layer, vibrant, silvery green shoots were aggressively pushing their way out of the main stem. The eucalyptus nitens had survived. Not only had they survived, but their deep taproots had anchored firmly into the rocky soil, preparing for explosive growth. However, survival did not mean immediate salvation. The trees needed time, and time was a luxury Sarah could not afford. The bank loan was still looming. To keep Arthur Pendleton from foreclosing, Sarah brokered a desperate, punishing deal. She would pay the interest monthly, delaying the principal collection for 5 years. To make those brutal payments, she took a graveyard shift at a manufacturing plant, 2 towns over, driving 50 miles each way in a rusted-out pickup, returning home just as the sun rose to tend to her land. The townsfolk of Oak Haven did not tire of the joke. The Jenkins folly became a local landmark. Teenagers would drive out to the property line on weekends just to throw beer bottles into the growing grove. But as 1984 rolled in, the laughter began to take on a sharper, more malicious edge. The trees were no longer fragile saplings. They had shot up to 10 feet tall, forming a dense, silvery blue forest that stood in stark alien contrast to the golden wheat fields of Oak Haven. The scent of eucalyptus oil hung heavy in the summer air, a sharp medicinal fragrance that infuriated Richard Gable. Gable's cattle grazed on the land directly adjacent to Sarah's property. In the late summer of 1984, the sabotage began. Sarah woke up one morning to find 300 feet of her barbed wire fence expertly snipped. Dozens of Gable's heavy Angus cattle had wandered into her grove, trampling hundreds of young trees and crushing months of hard work into the dirt. When Sarah confronted Gable at the town's feed store, he simply tipped his Stetson hat, his eyes cold and mocking. "Cattle have a mind of their own, Sarah. Maybe they were just trying to put those ugly weeds out of their misery. You should really maintain your fences better. The sheriff, a man firmly in Gable's pocket, refused to file a formal report, claiming it was a civil matter and likely an accident caused by rusted wire. Sarah knew better. She spent her precious weekend hours sinking deeper wooden posts and stringing heavy-duty double-barbed wire, her hands heavily taped, to protect against the razor-sharp metal. Then came the catastrophic drought of 1985. For 8 brutal months, barely a drop of rain fell on the Oakhaven Valley. The sky remained a relentless, punishing blue. The creeks dried up, and the shallow municipal wells began to pump mud. The local wheat farmers watched in despair as their crops withered into brittle brown husks before they could even form heads. Richard Gable's sprawling pastures turned to dust. His cattle grew ribs that pressed sharply against their hides, and he was forced to spend a fortune importing hay and trucking in water just to keep his herd alive. The entire town was gripped by a suffocating panic as livelihoods evaporated in the heat. Yet on the Jenkins property, an impossible miracle was unfolding. The eucalyptus forest, now towering 20 feet high, remained vibrantly, defiantly green. The deep tap roots of the Nittins had punched through the alkaline crust and tapped into the deep, untouched aquifer far below the surface water that traditional crops and shallow pasture grass could never reach. The trees thrived in the blistering sun, their waxy leaves reflecting the heat, casting deep, cool shadows over Sarah's land. Instead of commanding respect, Sarah's success bred bitter, venomous resentment. The town, suffering and desperate, needed a scapegoat. Mayor Harrison Davies called an emergency town hall meeting in August of 1985. The humid gymnasium was packed with angry, sweating farmers. Sarah sat alone in the back row. "The water table is dropping faster than we've ever seen," Mayor Davies announced through a crackling microphone, wiping his brow. "And we all know why." He pointed a trembling finger toward the back of the room. "Those foreign monster trees out on the Jenkins lot are sucking the valley dry. They're draining the water that rightfully belongs to our wheat and our livestock." An uproar of angry agreement echoed through the gym. Richard Gable stood up, playing to the crowd. "She's ruining this town out of sheer stubbornness. We need an injunction. We need those trees cut down and burned before Oakhaven turns into a desert." Sarah stood up, her legs shaking, but her voice remarkably steady. "My trees are drawing from the deep limestone aquifer Harrison, an aquifer none of your shallow agricultural wells even reach. The state geologist's report I filed last year proves it. You're losing crops because of the drought, not because of my farm." "They're an invasive nuisance," Gable shouted. "They're a hazard." The mayor attempted to pass a sudden municipal zoning ordinance to classify the eucalyptus as an invasive agricultural hazard, which would give the county the right to bulldoze the property. But Sarah had spent her nights reading more than just botanical journals. She had studied property law. She slapped a thick manila envelope onto the mayor's table. "Federal Agricultural Protection Clause." Sarah declared, her eyes locking with Gable's. "Because I receive a minor subsidy for experimental timber growth from the Department of Agriculture, a grant I secured 6 months ago, local zoning cannot override my crop without a federal environmental review. It will take you 3 years just to get a hearing in Washington." The room fell into a stunned, hateful silence. She had outmaneuvered them. The trees survived the drought. They survived the town's hatred. By the winter of 1987, the eucalyptus forest was a towering, majestic canopy of silver and green, the trunks thick and sturdy. But as Sarah walked through her silent, beautiful forest, a crushing reality weighed on her chest. The 5-year grace period on her father's bank loan was set to expire in March of 1988. She owed Arthur Pendleton $80,000 in principal plus ballooning interest. Her trees were fully mature and ready for harvest, but the specialized paper mills in the Pacific Northwest that she had planned to sell the timber to had suddenly pivoted to cheaper Canadian pine. The essential oil distilleries claimed her operation was too small to bother with. She had the most magnificent crop in the county, and absolutely no one to buy it. The laughter in town began to swell once more. Richard Gable was already drawing up the foreclosure paperwork with Arthur Pendleton, waiting like vultures for the clock to run out. Winter winds howled through the Oakhaven Valley in January of 1988, carrying a bitter chill that seeped through the thin walls of Sarah Jenkins' farmhouse. Inside the dining room table was buried under a mountain of rejection letters. She had spent the last 4 months calling every timber broker, paper mill, and essential oil distillery on the West Coast. The responses were uniformly disheartening. The American market was saturated with cheap pine from Canada, and her localized crop of eucalyptus nitens, despite its magnificent quality, was viewed as an untested risky anomaly by domestic buyers. Time was evaporating. The balloon payment of $86,000 principal plus accumulated interest was due on March 15th. Richard Gable did not even bother hiding his predatory joy. Confident that Sarah was financially cornered, he hired a surveying crew in early February to start marking the boundary lines between their properties. He instructed them to place their neon orange surveyor stakes aggressively close to her fence line, a psychological tactic designed to break whatever spirit she had left. Gable had already drawn up architectural plans for a massive irrigation pump house he intended to build right in the center of her eucalyptus grove once the bank handed him the deed. He openly bragged at the local diner that he was going to rent a bulldozer and personally tear down Jenkins' weeds the second the ink dried on the foreclosure papers. Sarah stopped going into town. She survived on canned soup and the sheer stubborn refusal to let Gable see her cry. Her only visitor was Dennis Harper, the mechanic who had always believed in her. He would drive out on Sunday afternoons, bringing spare parts to keep her aging tractor running and sharing silent cups of coffee on the porch, watching the silver leaves of the towering trees shimmer in the winter sunlight. "You did everything right, Sarah," Dennis said, one brutally cold afternoon, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "The trees are perfect. It's the market that's wrong." "The bank doesn't care about the market, Dennis," Sarah replied, her voice hollow, staring at the neon orange stakes Gable had planted near her gate. "They only care about the date on the calendar." But neither Sarah nor the insular town of Oakhaven understood the massive technological revolution erupting in corporate offices across the globe. By late 1987 and early 1988, the business world was being radically transformed by the widespread adoption of the fax machine and high-speed commercial copiers. Companies like Xerox and Hewlett-Packard were manufacturing machines that demanded a very specific type of paper, smooth, highly opaque, and resistant to curling under intense heat. Traditional long-fiber pine pulp created paper that was too rough and jammed the delicate internal rollers of these new machines. The global paper industry was in a state of absolute panic. They desperately needed short fiber pulp, which provided the exact smooth finish required for thermal and high-speed copy paper. And the absolute best source of premium short fiber pulp in the world was eucalyptus timber. Major international paper conglomerates, particularly those based in Japan, were dispatching corporate acquisition scouts across the globe, frantically searching for mature, harvest-ready eucalyptus plantations to feed their starving mills. On February 28th, just 2 weeks before the bank's deadline, a sleek, silver Mercedes-Benz sedan pulled onto the cracked asphalt of Oakhaven's main street. It was a vehicle so entirely out of place among the rusted pickup trucks and mud-caked tractors that it practically stopped traffic. The driver was a man named Gregory Wallace, a senior acquisitions broker for Pacific Century Pulp and Timber, an international consortium that supplied the largest paper manufacturers in Asia and Silicon Valley. Wallace had not stumbled upon Oakhaven by accident. Months earlier, out of sheer desperation, Sarah had submitted a detailed botanical analysis of her trees to a federal agricultural registry, hoping to qualify for a government conservation grant. Wallace's research team had intercepted the public filing. They couldn't believe their eyes. A fully mature 400-acre plot of eucalyptus nitens sitting entirely unnoticed in rural Oregon. Wallace parked his sedan outside the local feed store to ask for directions to the Jenkins property. Richard Gable, who happened to be loading bags of grain into his truck, spotted the expensive suit and immediately intervened. "You look lost, friend," Gable said, wiping his dusty hands on his jeans, sizing up the wealthy stranger. "If you're looking to invest in ranch land, you're talking to the right man. I own 5,000 acres of the best grazing pasture in the county." Wallace politely adjusted his tie. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Gable, but I have absolutely no interest in cattle. I'm looking for a Sarah Jenkins. I was told her property is nearby." Gable's friendly demeanor evaporated, replaced by a sneer of genuine confusion. "Sarah, what business could you possibly have with her? The bank is foreclosing on her dirt patch in 14 days. The only thing she's got out there is a useless forest of foreign weeds." A sharp, knowing smile touched the corners of Wallace's mouth. He looked at Gable with the pity reserved for the deeply ignorant. "Mr. Gable, if the data in my briefcase is accurate, that young woman is sitting on the most valuable timber reserve in the Pacific Northwest. Now, if you'll excuse me." Wallace drove away, leaving Gable standing frozen on the sidewalk, a cold knot of dread suddenly forming in the pit of his stomach. Dust billowed behind the silver Mercedes as it navigated the winding dirt road leading to the Jenkins farm. Sarah was in the yard splitting firewood with a heavy steel axe when the luxury car rolled to a stop near her front porch. She leaned against the wooden handle, wiping her brow, deeply suspicious of the man in the tailored suit stepping onto her property. "Miss Jenkins?" Gregory Wallace extended a manicured hand. "My name is Gregory Wallace. I represent Pacific Century Pulp and Timber. I apologize for the unannounced visit, but my company is facing a critical supply shortage, and your federal crop filing caught our immediate attention." Sarah lowered the axe, her heart giving a violent, unpredictable lurch. "You're a timber buyer." "I am a buyer of very specific timber," Wallace corrected, looking past her toward the towering silver-blue canopy that stretched across the 400 acres. "May I inspect the grove?" For the next 3 hours, Wallace and an independent botanist he had brought along walked the endless rows of Sarah's forest. They took core samples from the thick trunks, tested the moisture content of the soil, and analyzed the fibrous density of the bark. Sarah watched them from a distance, her hands shoved deep into her jacket pockets, hardly daring to breathe. When Wallace finally emerged from the tree line, his impeccably shined shoes were covered in alkaline dust, but his eyes were shining with intense, unrestrained excitement. "Miss Jenkins, I have been to commercial plantations in Brazil and South Africa, and I have rarely seen a yield as robust as this," Wallace said, shaking his head in disbelief. "The cold stress from your winters, combined with the deep aquifer watering, has forced the trees to produce an incredibly dense, premium short-fiber wood. It is exactly, and I mean exactly, what our corporate clients need for their thermal paper divisions." Sarah swallowed hard. "Are you making me an offer?" "I am not making you an offer to buy your timber, Miss Jenkins," Wallace said seriously. "I am making you an offer to partner with us. Eucalyptus is a coppicing tree. When we cut it down, It will naturally regrow from the stump, giving us a new harvest every 6 to 8 years. We don't just want this harvest, we want exclusive rights to the next 3. Wallace opened his briefcase right there on the hood of his Mercedes and produced a preliminary contract. When Sarah saw the number printed at the bottom of the page, her knees nearly buckled. It wasn't just enough to pay off the bank. It was an astronomical sum, a multi-million-dollar guarantee that would make her the wealthiest landowner in Oakhaven. March 15, 1988, arrived with a heavy oppressive silence in the lobby of Oakhaven National Bank. Arthur Pendleton sat behind his mahogany desk, the foreclosure documents neatly arranged before him. Richard Gable sat in a leather chair by the window, wearing a smug, triumphant grin, casually twirling a silver pen. He had brought his own checkbook ready to buy the seized land from the bank the moment Sarah's default became official. At precisely 10 o'clock in the morning, the heavy glass doors of the bank swung open. Sarah Jenkins walked in. She was not wearing her dusty work clothes. She wore a sharp, tailored navy blazer, her chin held high, radiating a cold, impenetrable confidence. She walked past the tellers, ignoring the stares of the bank staff, and stepped into Pendleton's office without knocking. "Sarah." Pendleton sighed, tapping his pen against the desk. "I'm sorry it has come to this, but the deadline has arrived. If you'll just sign over the deed—" "I'm not here to sign your foreclosure papers, Arthur," Sarah interrupted, her voice ringing clear and authoritative through the quiet bank. She reached into her leather portfolio and dropped a cashier's check directly onto the foreclosure documents. Pendleton froze. He looked down at the check. It was drawn from a major international commercial bank, certified and cleared. It was for $86,000, the exact amount of her debt, down to the penny. Gable stood up, the color completely draining from his face. "Where did you get that kind of money?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "That's impossible. Nobody wants those weeds." "They aren't weeds, Richard," Sarah said, turning to face the man who had tormented her for 6 years. "They're eucalyptus nitens, and as of yesterday, Pacific Century Pulp and Timber holds the exclusive export rights to my harvest. The total contract is worth roughly $3.2 million. The silence in the office was absolute. Pendleton's jaw went slack, his hands trembling as he stared at the check. Gable stumbled backward, bumping into the leather chair, looking as though he had just been physically struck. The empire he had plotted to steal had just slipped through his fingers, transforming the woman he mocked into an untouchable titan. "Process the payoff, Arthur," Sarah commanded softly, "and mail the deed to my farmhouse. If you ever threaten my family's land again, I will buy this bank and fire you myself." 3 weeks later, specialized logging crews arrived in Oakhaven. The town watched in stunned, awestruck silence as a fleet of heavy transport trucks hauled thousands of tons of premium eucalyptus timber out of the valley, destined for international ports. The ultimate twist of fate arrived 2 years later. Richard Gable, who had deeply over-leveraged his finances to keep his cattle alive during the drought of 1985, finally defaulted on his own massive loans. His ranch went up for public auction. Sarah Jenkins sat in the front row of the county courthouse. When the auctioneer opened the bidding for Gable's prized 5,000-acre estate, Sarah raised her paddle. She outbid every corporate rancher in the room in less than 3 minutes, paying entirely in cash. She didn't buy the land for cattle. She bought it to plant more trees. Sarah's story proves that the greatest victories often require walking through years of doubt, mockery, and isolation. When the world tells you your ideas are weeds, sometimes you just have to wait for the right season to prove them wrong. If you found Sarah's incredible resilience inspiring, please hit the like button, share this incredible true-life farming drama with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories of underdogs who changed history.